Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, continuing our series on conversations with luminaries on cutting edge science. And, well, we call it spirituality, but you could call it self awareness, consciousness, anything, um, complementing what we know is out there with what we know is in here. And today I'm very privileged to have my friend, mentor, guide, co author Rudy Tanzi. He has a book with Rudy, The Healing Self. And that's our third book together. And prior to that, we had Super Genes and then Super Brain. And Rudy is a very eminent neuroscientist. He's at Harvard, he's a geneticist, and you'll see all about him in the bio. But more importantly, Rudy's an amazing scientist and a great friend. He's the discoverer of dozens of genes. Every time I talk to him, he's discovered a new gene, and I'm talking about genes, genetic information, not blue genes. And Rudy's a world-renowned expert in Alzheimer's and discovered genes for Wilson's disease, Alzheimer's genes, many others, particularly to do with neurological problems. Um, so today, Rudy is joining me because we have a lot of things to update, um, and thought we should share our updates with you. First of all, thank you, Rudy, for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Deepak. It's so great to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So, Rudy, a lot has been happening. Last time we met was in Lake Nona after that conference. And since then, actually, the pandemic has been raging, the COVID-19 pandemic. And neither you nor I have had much time uh, to think about the pandemic the way the world is thinking, in terms of panic, because we've been busy. You've been busy. I've been busy. I've been sharing information with the world. And you've had a lot of amazing new science in the last 1 year, since I saw you 9 months ago. But the last year, 1 year has been very fruitful in terms of your research and in terms of what you do at Mass General with your colleagues. Just let's have an update on the science, all the things you've been doing this last 1 year, all the publications. By the way, guys, Rudy also prepared a human brain in a petri dish. So that was before last year.
Yeah, well, things have been going well. If I had to summarize the type of work we do, I discovered the first Alzheimer's genes a long time ago, and continue to find more Alzheimer's genes. But what we do is we find these genes, and then we learn what they do well, and when they're healthy genes, and when they're mutations in these genes that cause Alzheimer's. We say Alzheimer's gene. There's no such thing as an Alzheimer's gene. All genes are good. You may have a mutation in a gene that then leads to or predisposes to Alzheimer's.
And the
And
mutation is an error, basically a typo in the spelling of the gene, right?
sure, yeah, you have, in your DNA, you have 3 billion bases of DNA, like three billion rungs on a long ladder that's twisted and separated into little pieces called chromosomes. And every once in a while, just one rung on that ladder that's the wrong one out of 3 billion can guarantee you'll get Alzheimer's disease by 40 years old. And those were the first mutations that we found, were these mutations that guaranteed early onset Alzheimer's disease usually under 50 years old. And luckily, they're very rare. And as we pointed out in our book, Super Genes, most mutations don't guarantee diseases of age. The 99% of them simply predispose, they don't guarantee. But the mutations we found that guarantee the disease, unfortunately, the early onset Alzheimer's genes, we were able to take those and then put them into mini human brain organoids in a dish. And it's not even a dish now. These things are the size of a paper punch. So it's in a tray, that you can hold in your hand with 96 little wells in it, the size of paper punches. And each one, there's a little mini human brain organoid where in 1 month we recreate Alzheimer's disease that takes an entire lifetime in 1 month. And because we can make so many of these, unlike using mice, and by the way, mice are just terrible models for Alzheimer's, and we don't like using mice anyway. As you know, I'm vegetarian and we try not to hurt animals anyway. But in the Alzheimer's in a dish brain organoid model, it's made screening for new compounds or natural products that might help 10 times faster and 100 times cheaper. So as a result of this revolution, going from genes to model systems and little brain organoids in a dish, and then we screened every known approved drug that's safe and every natural product we could find in the world where you buy collections of these. Ayurvedics, from the Peruvian rainforest, Chinese herbal medicines. And because it's so fast now, we screen them all. We screened all of them and say, which ones stop different parts of Alzheimer's disease pathology? And we found a bunch of them. And the cool thing is, if you find ones that stop inflammation, so in the Healing Self, we wrote about how inflammation is the main killer of the body, how chronic stress, how bad diet, lack of sleep, lack of exercise, loneliness, all increase chronic inflammation, not just in the body, but in the brain. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, inflammation is caused by the earlier pathology called plaques and tangles, but it's the inflammation that does most of the killing. And this is true in other diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's disease, even schizophrenia, depression. Inflammation is what does most of the damage. So we found compounds, natural products, or drugs, approved drugs, that stop inflammation in the brain or protect against it. And we had a huge breakthrough this year. Seven years ago, I started a company with two kids. I call them the kids because they were undergraduates at Brown University. And they found me and asked for a meeting. And one of them graduated from the same school my daughter goes to. And they were in a fraternity, national fraternity called Sigma Chi that I was in when I was in college. So I said, I'll take the meeting. And they had this very nascent idea about how to protect against inflammation with one natural product and one approved drug. And fast forward, we decided to test that combination in ALS. We could have done Alzheimer's or Parkinson first, or even other diseases, but ALS is a real big unmet medical need. ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, terrible disease. Anyway, we did the trial in Mass General in our center. And this is the Healy Center that my chief, Merit Sokovich, runs, and we collaboration with a center I co-direct called the McCance Center for Brain Health. And the trial worked. ALS hasn't had a new drug in ages. Our trial significantly delayed the symptoms of ALS and even more significantly extended lifespan. So the patients were living more than a year longer so far by being on this drug combination. So the company Amylyx, and for transparency, I am a co-founder and have equity in the company, of course, but I want to state that. But now we're looking at possible FDA approval. We're asking the FDA for approval this year. And we're very lucky that 50,000 people unsolicited wrote a petition to get this drug approved to the FDA because they're so happy with how it helped their loved ones. And we're doing an Alzheimer's trial at the same time because, we're hoping that if it worked in ALS, maybe we can get the same results in Alzheimer's. And so this is the first combination therapy that actually protects against the inflammation that kills the most nerve cells in the brain with age, and in your diseases like Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson, et cetera. And that was all this past year. So terrible year because of COVID, but maybe there'll be an exclamation point for how we do with treating neurodegenerative disease.
Well, congratulations, Rudy. This is amazing work, and it'll benefit a lot of people, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, because once you have something that tackles inflammation, you can target not just one disease, but probably all chronic illness is associated to some extent with inflammation,
Large
and
extent. Yeah.
all chronic disease.
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah.
just Alzheimer's or Lou Gehrig's or ALS, it's cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, autoimmune disease. Cancer also is aggravated through by inflammation. And of course, we know that inflammation, and particularly low grade inflammation, low grade anxiety, low grade depression all go together. So, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Secondly, because of what we're talking about, because the healing self is basically based on the idea that if you tackle inflammation through the strategies you mentioned, shield formula, deep rest, sleep, meditation, stress management, deep breathing, mind body coordination, vagal stimulation, changing the diet to a more diverse diet, which is rich in microbiome diversity. All this has a significant effect. And what you've been saying all along is that certain genes will guarantee the disease, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Certain
Other
gene mutations. Yeah.
in the future, maybe gene editing might be one thing you can do about that, or blocking the activity of the gene as you're doing with drugs. But 95% of illness, we still need to have what we call a more holistic approach. So, in the last few days, I've been actually talking to a lot of other scientists in basic fields, things like uh, I just interviewed Frank Wilczek, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering a new particle that may give us some access to what we call the nature of dark matter. And Wilczek has written a new book called Fundamentals, and it's all about space time and fundamental particles, and a very good, uh, almost encyclopedic update on what force fields are, what is gravity, what are fundamental particles. Actually, not to digress too much, he has a whole chapter on just the very fundamental nature of matter, as he calls it. And he said, all you have to know is that the most fundamental particles of nature are, or activities of nature are, in his words, mass, spin, and charge. And then he further went on to say that neither mass, spin, or charge are physical entities. They're structureless points of density where these properties reside, but they're not, things you can look at under a microscope. There's no such thing. They're just qualities, the most fundamental qualities. And this basically led him to look at science in a more complementary manner, which he was not. Like right now, 99% science is reductionist. If you're not reductionist and your science is reductionist, but you also complement with all this writing about the healing self, but actually it's very insightful when you look at uh, reality from a very reductionist point of view, and then you also look at it from its complementary point of view, holism. So with that, because I had this opportunity to update people on your work and healing self, I also thought we have a potential audience here over several weeks of about 15 million people. And I thought not only should we update them on the healing self, which you did, and inflammation, which you did, but give them a little bit of insight into how genes work and how the body works. It's very exciting to understand this. So we have, you would say, 25,000 genes or so from our parents.
Minimally.
Okay. And then we have
There
about
may be
what?
more. We're finding more all the time.
Okay. And then we have what? A couple of million back microbial genes, right? In our body as well.
Yeah, but they're kind of redundant with each other. Bacteria genes are
Say that
often,
again.
many of the bacteria have, genes that are similar to each other. So there's more diversity in our own genes.
There's more. You
Yeah,
mean
we have more diversity in our genes because we're more evolved species. So the
species?
bacteria, there's more overall genes among our bacteria in our gut. You have thousands of bacterial strains in your gut
Yeah.
and trillion in
And they
humans.
do contribute
Oh,
genetic information,
sure.
obviously, and they're in our skin, in our gut, everywhere, right? On all the orifices of our body. So they are participating with our human genes,
Absolutely.
interacting in the metabolism of our body,
Yeah.
right?
Your gut microbiome. So you have thousands of different strains of bacteria, trillions of them in your gut. And what makes them healthy is plants, fiber. So a lot of people focus on taking probiotics, right? There's 5 or 6 bacteria on your yogurt container out of thousands that live in your gut. And then people take a probiotic with 5 or 6 bacteria in it. And they take maybe a probiotic with 500 million or 1 billion bacteria, and they're thrown into a pool, 5 strains, 1 billion bacteria, they're thrown into a pool of thousands of strains of bacteria with trillions of them. So a probiotic is fine, but much more importantly, you want to feed the bacteria you have with plants, plant-based foods, fiber. So seeds, nuts, whole grains, vegetables, fruits. That's what they thrive on. And if you keep those gut bacteria healthy through the vagus nerve, which connects to the brain, you get constant interplay where the brain is informing the gut and the gut is informing the brain. And you can control, we showed in models that you can control Alzheimer's pathology in the brain through the gut. We can change the gut of the brain and affect how many plaques are in the brain or how much inflammation is in the brain. In fact, we wrote in Supergenes about microRNA, which is one of the entities by which you control gene activity or gene expression through epigenetics. So the person who discovered microRNA is Gary Ruvkin at Mass General, and he'll eventually get the Nobel Prize for that. He's in the queue. But he and I just started a new company called Marvel, like Marvel Comics, Marvel Biome, where we like to say, bugs as drugs. We isolated every bacteria in the gut, all the strains of bacteria. And then, little nematode worms, C. elegans, they eat bacteria, okay? So then you take the nematodes and you grow them in each well of a tray. And each nematode, you give one single strain of bacteria. And in that worm, you've genetically programmed them to have inflammation or the damage of inflammation. And then you ask, if does this bacteria or this one, thousands at a time, does this single strain of bacteria that lives in your gut either protect or stop the inflammation in this little tiny dirt worm in a well? And if it does, then what you do is you take that bacteria and make a probiotic out of that. And this is going to be a bacteria you never heard of. It's not going to be the one on your yogurt container. And you use that bacteria as a drug. So you put that bacteria into the gut and let it, colonize. And then it's going to send the right things to the brain to stop inflammation based on how it helped the little nematode that had inflammation, the little dirtworm. Entirely new idea. And we've already found in this company 10 different bacteria that most people never heard of, even biologists, that live in your gut that have tremendous effects on protecting against the damage of neuroinflammation. And we're going to plan a clinical trial with those soon for ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases.
That's amazing and a very revelatory in many ways that you can derive a drug by looking at the bacteria in the gut. But what you're also saying is one of the best ways to influence or decrease inflammation in the body is through a diet that is rich, plant-based, in biodiverse, and also has a lot of fiber. And
Yes.
that is one of the most effective ways to decrease inflammation in the gut, which influences the brain as well. And this is mediated through the vagus nerve. And now we know there are so many other ways of also stimulating the vagus nerve. I've been exploring bandhas and kriyas and deep breathing and chanting and vocalization, all stimulating the vagus nerve. So now we're looking at the pathways of yogic practices like, chanting, for example, or deep
Yeah.
breathing or singing or or Gregorian chants. They all stimulate the vagus nerve, and this is something we should look at. Look at the microbiome,
Well,
look at the
yeah, yeah,
inflammation of these.
the question is, when you stimulate the vagus nerve, are you stimulating the communication from the gut to the brain? And if the gut is healthy, are you helping the brain in doing that?
Yeah,
And I tell you another revelatory discovery we just made. If you look at the brain, so some people who are younger die of accidents, motorcycle, whatever. So we've been looking at whether there's bacteria from the gut in the brain. And it turns out in, in people who died, unfortunately, at a young age due to an accident, we see an overwhelming amount, a surprising amount of the good bacteria in the gut, the probiotic bacteria in the gut in the brain. But when you look at the brain samples from people who were old when they died or had Alzheimer's, there's none. So it actually looks like the bacteria, this is brand new, but it's looking like the bacteria that are beneficial in the gut actually make their way into the brain, especially in younger people. And not so much as you get older, but maybe if you took care of your gut microbiome as you get older and stimulated your vagal nerve, the question is, would you get more of these beneficial bacteria into the brain where they can directly help protect against neuroinflammation and all the onslaught on nerve cells as you get older? So we're looking into
that
that.
also is very fascinating. As we know, the traffic in the vagus nerve is bidirectional. So, and more serotonin comes into circulation from the gut than from the brain. I'm told that the majority of serotonin is actually produced in the gut, and
Yes.
that's powerful antidepressant, as we know.
Yeah, we like your gut controls your mood. And it's not just if you eat, a junky diet and you feel bad, you you feel bad. But it's also that, like you were just saying, the bacteria in your gut can actually control neurotransmitters and neurochemicals that affect your mood in your brain. That's
Yeah.
outside of what it does for brain health.
And all these mood changing hormones or peptides, whatever we want to call them, they also happen to be immunomodulators, right? They modulate the activity of the immune system.
That's exactly right. And we also looked in the brain to see if there's certain bacteria present in the Alzheimer's brain versus someone the same age who didn't have Alzheimer's, a control. And we found 3 strains of bacteria. This is unpublished. We found 3 strains of bacteria that were more abundant in the Alzheimer's disease brains than the control brains. All 3 of them come from bad gums. So we found 3 different periodontal bacteria that were overrepresented in Alzheimer brain versus control brain. So, if those bacteria are pathogenic and they get into the brain, they can trigger Alzheimer's pathology directly. So we're looking into that as well. We have a lot of data that the plaques that form in Alzheimer's disease are not just junk. They can actually be reacting to bacteria or viruses, and they form to trap the microbe and protect the nerve cells. So we're looking at that as, besides genetics, as another cause of the initial pathology, the plaques, the tangles in Alzheimer's. But as we've learned, that then has to trigger inflammation to get the disease. Like, as you were saying before, most diseases, you have enough of something going wrong where cells die that triggers inflammation. Then it's inflammation that really takes you out. If you stop the inflammation, you can get away with a lot.
So, my friends, that's a very concise update of what Rudy's been up to in the last year following our publication of the book as well. But now we get to some issues that are not so scientific, or possibly they are, but they're controversial. And I can only talk like this to Rudy because he's open, and he is also a great explorer of consciousness. So, Rudy, now that we've covered genetics, to some extent epigenetics, but you want to say any couple of words about epigenetics before I ask you the remaining questions? We have about 15 minutes left. So, epigenetics, basically summarize epigenetics in a few sentences.
Yeah, I would just say you can't control the DNA and genes your parents give you. And I'm not a big fan of editing those genes that your parents give you, because I treat the genome like a good sailor treats the ocean. As soon as you think you know it, it's going to take you out. So I don't think we have enough wisdom yet to stop manipulating the genome. But if we live the right way to minimize inflammation, then you can program your genes. You can't change the DNA, but you can program your gene expression. So 25,000 genes going up or down like a rheostat, as we wrote about in Super Genes. And good diet, lots of sleep, exercise, healthy social life, learning new things, all these things program your genes in the right direction to keep you healthy. And it does that because the gene activity is being modulated by stuff, by proteins and that are binding to the DNA and controlling how it acts. You're controlling the gene activity or gene expression, as we say. And you don't have to understand the nuances of which chemicals and proteins do that, or microRNAs. You only have to know how to live your life in a way that programs those genes in a way that keeps you healthy. And the main thing is avoiding inflammation. And then that programs your genes the right way to continue. And part of that would be that your genes will make sure, by interacting with the neuroplasticity of your brain, that you do keep eating a good diet. Good new habits form. Once you get there, eating a good diet means you keep wanting a good diet. Getting good sleep means you can't do without good sleep. Getting exercise means I have to have my exercise today. Learning new things means, hey, I need to learn something new, not just watch mindless TV. I don't want to eat junk food. I do want to eat good food. And you can genetically program yourself to do that simply by rewiring yourself at the level of your brain, like we wrote in Super Brains, the neuroplasticity to take on the right habits. So that's how the neuroplasticity of the brain translates to epigenetics to keep you healthy. You just got to allow yourself to get an autopilot by rewiring and rewiring your brain, reprogram your genes to get to where you have to be. So I think that's the kind of the synopsis of our first two books. And in the Healing Self, we talk specifically about inflammation and how to avoid that, because that's the biggest killer.
So, and you've already mentioned we don't need to know the details like deacetylation or methylation and all that, but those are basically the mechanisms through which genes go on and off in their activity.
Yeah.
And everything is regulated, if we were to use one word, um, by experience. Experience changes gene activity. Can we say that?
Yes, the
Including
brain.
emotion.
Yes, the brain metabolizes experience, which is then translated into gene activity so that you are then shaped by your experiences genetically and at the level of your neural network.
And one of the most important experiences, of course, is mental experience that we call emotions. So if I'm stressed, I'll have lots of cortisol. I might secrete more adrenaline, more inflammation. Cortisol is an immunocompromiser, so more susceptibility or less immune surveillance just because I'm stressed, anxious, angry, depressed, whatever, but I feel emotionally distraught.
Yep.
And of course, we know that emotions like love, empathy, compassion, joy, happiness are associated with other kind of peptides, serotonin, dopamine, opiates, oxytocin, which have the opposite effect in modulating our immune system.
Yeah.
So now I'm coming
Yeah.
to
I was just going to say, we just started a new study looking at how COVID pandemic is affecting cortisol levels by looking at cortisol levels in strands of hair. It turns out that much better than saliva, you can get a better idea of current cortisol levels by analyzing someone's hair. So we're doing that now in the general population and in post-COVID to look at the effects of COVID stress. and then asking how that's affecting overall brain health and epigenetics. So,
Okay, that's amazing update on science. Now let's go a little deeper because I
yeah,
want to go
let's
deeper.
go.
As you know, my interest is in Ayurveda, which is called the science of life. Ayurveda comes from a bigger, broader understanding of consciousness, which comes from a bigger discipline called Vedanta, which talks about non-dual reality, which says that everything is consciousness, mind, brain, body, experience, world is all in consciousness. And one of the very fundamental premises of Ayurveda is if you want to know what your experiences were in the past, look at your body now. If you want to know what your body will look like in the future, look at your experiences right now. So it starts with that. Then it goes on to say, where is experience metabolized? And you said experience is metabolized in the brain, which is a very good, brain is the physical material correlate of, I would say, mind. So when we talk to scientists, and when I talk to some scientists, they say, is the brain doing the mind or is the mind doing the brain? And they say neither is doing the other. They're both correlated activities in consciousness. So all experience is happening in consciousness, and then it is being metabolized, of course, as the mind, brain, body, world experience. The world experiences in consciousness, the mind experiences in consciousness, the body experiences in consciousness, even the brain. You look at a brain, it's an experience in consciousness. The brain is experienced in consciousness. But never mind all that. The very practical implication of this is you and I having a conversation right now. And this is a pretty intellectual conversation. And as a result, your brain activity in this cortex is being correlated with brain activity in my cortex. And our brain activities are not only monitoring each other's brain activities, they're being regulated by each other's brain activities. So I am regulating yours, you're regulating mine, I'm monitoring you, you're monitoring mine. And it's all happening very spontaneously, this interaction. Neuropeptides are being released, electrochemical activity is happening, the body is responding depending on the conversation. If this was an emotional conversation, people are feeling happy, then we are secreting those peptides, etc., serotonin, cortisol, depending on what the conversation is right now. Different parts of the brain are being activated and different peptides are being released. Different interactions are happening in the body. And it so happens that, say, millions of people are watching us right now. They're also participating in this conversation, albeit they're listening. They're not, giving us feedback, but their minds are working right now. So, at a mind body level, at a body mind level, right this moment, we are, let's assume millions of people are watching us. At a mind body level, all millions of us are actually participating in the matrix of body mind interactions. And that leads to a very, very interesting question. Where is this being metabolized for all of us? One way would be, in each of our brains. The other is, if consciousness is not in the brain, but in the activity of the brain, then this modulation is happening in cyberspace right now. And that cyberspace is a space of shared consciousness, shared awareness. And actually, what we call the internet is now an evolving global brain. I mean, this is a big idea, but it is an evolving global brain. And you can see how it influences us. You go on Twitter and you see a tweet from President Trump and your blood pressure goes up, okay? Or you go on the internet and you listen to your favorite music and suddenly you're making oxytocin. So the body mind is everywhere right now, okay? And if we understand this, and we also understand that our bodies are the metabolism of experience, this is where Ayurveda says, change your experiences and you change your body. You change your body. Now, this is what I'm going to ask you. Genes that we have, the human genes and bacterial genes, genes by themselves are the record of the experiences of our ancestors. Would you say that? Or at least they represent to some extent the phenotype of our ancestors and their experiences. And then we have our own experiences. Right now, you go to a football game, you see a great concert, you fall in love, you take drugs, maybe, or something happened intrauterine. All of that, by the way, in my tradition is called karma. Now, karma people have their own definitions, but karma is just past experiences that we metabolized in consciousness. And we carry the trace, and also not only the past experiences, but how we interpreted them. I could be on a joyride and I could be stressed, or I could be on a joyride and be happy. And so the same experience with different interpretation. So when you look at genetics and epigenetics, it raises a whole new issue. Is if experience is happening in consciousness and consciousness is non-local and we communicate with each other only in consciousness, are we influencing each other's biology just by the news we read, the speeches we give to each other, the way we conduct our behavior, the way we speak to each other? Is our collective consciousness influencing gene activity in sentient beings, particularly right now in human beings?
Well, yes. I mean, when I listen to you now, well, first of all, let me say that we agree, and this gets deeper, that uh, existence is in consciousness. But our consciousness, when we say this is the brain and we feel, let's say you do an autopsy and you feel the brain, here's the brain. You can argue, is there a material thing that's actually floating around in some magical house we call the universe, or is it all in consciousness? As a scientist, I find it easier to believe everything's in consciousness than there's the existence of actual material trinkets that came out of nowhere floating in some magical house called the universe that just ends. That's kind of hard to fathom if you're a scientist, although that's what most scientists believe.
And
But,
yet,
but it's
we are.
easier to believe that everything's in consciousness and information is being assembled into systems and into models, and including seeing the brain itself and how we define it in consciousness. But in this case, we're studying a brain that we believe creates consciousness when really it's part of consciousness, interpreting consciousness for us. I like to think that experience, think about neurons, whether you want to say they're in consciousness or they're material. Neurons are like the furnace. They burn experience and create a fire and an energy that's the mind. And all of this is in consciousness. So experience is creating the mind. From when you're a baby, you have experiences and you learn to put things in context. You learn to associate one thing with another. When you first see, as a baby, this blue bottle, you don't know it's for holding water or for drinking. It's just something that's a shape in blue. But then later you'll learn what it's for. So every time you have an experience, you're putting things in context through a neural network of 1 billion neurons with trillions of connections that create your world for you. So if you're in charge of creating your world, how others are affecting the world you experience, they're affecting your brain itself. They're affecting the world you create in your brain. So we can talk that way, but we can also talk about whether there really is a brain, whether it's all in consciousness. I do believe it's all in consciousness. So I do believe that there's a lot of plasticity. There's a lot of flexibility and plasticity.
So once we go that route, that all experiences in consciousness, including obviously the experience of what we call objects, but according to consciousness experts, what we call an object is a human construct for a perceptual activity. And then we model that perceptual activity, we reify it, we call that's an iPhone, or that's a hand, that's a body, it's a changing activity. And so in the last few months, I've been doing a series with our friend Don Hoffman on what he calls the case against reality. And Don Hoffman trained with the Crick, Watson and Crick fame. And Crick had this astonishing hypothesis that everything, is a result of activity in the brain, whatever your deepest desires, etc. He gave both Christoph Koch and our friend Don Hoffman the responsibility prove the astonishing hypothesis. And Don Hoffman said the astonishing hypothesis reminded him of Aladdin's lamp. You scratch this thing called the brain, and it conjures up a world, a world. It conjures up the Milky Way galaxy and all of that. All you have to do is scratch Aladdin's lamp here in the brain. So he found it difficult. And so he spent, the last 25 years looking at the astonishing hypothesis, finally came to the conclusion that it's not true. So now he's becoming an expert on how consciousness regulates everything in what we call space-time geometry. Now, let me finish. So in the last few months, I've been talking to him about this issue in The New Scientist. It's called Evolution, the Changing Face of Our Greatest Theory of Nature. Now, with Don Hoffman, I've been talking about the physics of this. And if you're amenable, because you're a geneticist, this issue, which I'll send to you, it's a relatively recent issue. It actually questions very, very strongly the whole notion of mechanistic, Darwinian, random evolution, and natural selection. And
as we did in our book, as we did in Supergenes.
As we've said in Supergenes.
Yeah.
So here are some of the headlines here. Number one, genes aren't destiny. Number two, evolution shows intelligence. Number three, move over selfish gene, which is what I would say to our friend Richard Dawkins.
Sounds like our book, Deepak.
Yeah. Number four, there's more to inheritance than genes. Number five, species don't really exist. That I found very interesting, that, even species are interspecies. Number six, adapt first, mutate later. Number seven, we can shape our own evolution. Number eight, change can be quick. In other words, mutations can be very quick. Number nine, survival of the luckiest. Number 10, genes don't just come from parents. Number 11, some things are better at evolving than other things. Number 12, evolution favors certain outcomes. Number 13, we can stop evolution. And there we are. So
Deepak, we wrote all this in Supergenes in 2015.
Yes, but if you think it's a good idea,
they're catching up to us.
It is catching up to us. But if you think this is a good idea, we should do a series on each of these and correlate it with what we said in Supergenes. Are you game for that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, in Supergenes, we really told these same stories that when we talk about evolution, there is, and I can't even get into it at the level of epigenetics. When you have DNA that's being structurally shaped by epigenetics, it's also going to determine where you expose DNA from mutations. So your lifestyle is shaping structurally how your DNA is folded. That's going to determine which parts of the DNA are exposed outside and what's wrapped inside, which is going to expose where mutations occur. So yeah, mutations follow adaptation, whereas Darwin said you only have mutations, he said it the other way around. So we said all this stuff in Supergenes, but I think we're a little bit ahead of our time when we wrote that. Maybe we'll, hopefully the people who wrote this will go back to the book, because all of this stuff is where we're going. It's not just Darwinian, it's Lamarkian, that our lifestyle, by determining our gene activity, also determines how the DNA is structured in cells, which determines where the new mutations are going to occur. So that means adaptation. How you live is driving your genetics. It's not just your genetics driving how you live.
So, really, this is so exciting that we can shape our evolution. And actually, I'm now looking at the planetary biome, not only our biome, but you and I are going to be on a scientific committee looking at neuropsychiatry and nutrition and moods and all this. But we are also looking at the planetary biome, which is all the genetic information on our
All
planet.
connected.
Hmm? And it's
It's
all
all connected.
connected.
I
And
mean,
even COVID mutation may be a result of a stressed genetic matrix, in
or,
our.
or, or, or a misguided vaccine approach against SARS corona, but we can go there some other
Yeah,
time.
we can go there some other time. But what I would like to do in a month, or maybe once a month, we catch up on evolution, genetics, and the future of life on our planet. If because this is
I just want to clarify what I didn't mean to say that the new vaccine, I wasn't talking about the new COVID vaccine. I'm behind the new COVID vaccine
yeah.
completely. But there's some evidence that perhaps years ago, when they were trying to make a better vaccine against the original SARS coronavirus,
No, I
that may have led to the mutations,
yeah. I think
it
we learn more about
led to
vaccine.
COVID-19. That's what I was trying to say.
We learn more about vaccine.
I don't want to come off out of context as a anti-vaxxer. I believe we all have to get the COVID. We all have to get the COVID vaccine. Yes.
I grew up in India where I saw people paralyzed for life with polio, scarred for life with smallpox, and diseased for life with tuberculosis, all saved, millions of lives saved through vaccination. So,
Yes.
I'm a fan of vaccination, and we don't have to be either totally reductionist or totally holistic. They're complementary approaches to each other. So, for all of us there listening, vaccines are saving lives right now and will continue to save lives, and they get better every day.
Hopefully, everyone get the COVID vaccine. But can I tell you one really quick in the last minutes? The one revelation I had recently about the word matter.
About the word?
The word matter.
Yeah.
So we argue about whether there's a material world. Is there really a physical material world, or is it all perceived in consciousness as ordered assemblies of information within consciousness? And you ask, what is matter? And I think that in a world of consciousness, you know what's matter? What matters?
Consciousness matters. If you use the word matter as a verb,
it's
then
what
consciousness
matters.
is mattering all the time.
So what's happening is in our consciousness, and you were saying shared consciousness, as a species, we have a species-specific world, just like a bacteria or a mouse. We can only perceive the world limited by our senses. And we wrote about that. So you have the species-specific world. And then as we all perceive it together with the same sensory system, right? We then determine together what we value most and what matters. And then in this world we live in consciousness, what matters becomes what we call matter in our world.
Agree.
Yeah.
And such is our bias that if we don't think something is important, we say it does not matter.
Does not matter. Exactly.
Because we have a physicalist bias.
Or you say, what's the matter?
Yeah, what's the matter? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rudy, we will continue this conversation, and I think I will send a video link and this conversation to our friend, the geneticist in Chicago. I forget his name. The militant guy who believes that consciousness is irrelevant. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes. There's a few of them.
There's a few of them.
Which I don't know which one you're referring to, but there are a few of them. Yes.
The guy from Chicago, the professor.
Yeah. I'm so glad I forgot his name.
Well, I'm not so glad because I'm going to send him a copy, him and Richard Dawkins and all the other friends who think.
Well, these guys, when we wrote Super Genes,
yeah,
these guys all attacked us.
Yeah, they did.
It was, came out in 2015. And now what you just read in that magazine, every single one of those points was in Super Genes. And we got attacked by the realists and the armchair biologists, Darwinians, as saying the world is only what you can perceive through your senses. So I'm like, well, if I was a bacteria, there would be a whole different world through my senses. Let's move beyond that and not just be species specific and say what's out there in consciousness, because that's what we are perceiving in our senses. You know, sensory systems are very important. We underplay them. We didn't write enough about sensory systems, but they limit us to the world we see. And the smarter people know that there's more than what you can perceive through your senses, and that millions of years from now, we're going to evolve to have even a greater sensory ability, and the whole world that we define is going to be different. And even then, there'll be people who say that's all there is, and others will say just wait till we have other sensory systems, and then you'll see what more there can be. And guess what? There's no limit. It's infinite. And that's where you get to the point that it's
That's
all
infinite. That's beautifully said.
all in consciousness.
Beautifully said. And in fact, in the Vedic, what do you call, ontology and epistemology, biological organisms are just sensory systems. They're just basically biosensors. That's all we are. We are a sensor, and we interact with other sensors, and all sensors are what we say conscious agents that are differentiated from the infinite, which is formless consciousness.
Yes.
And at the end, there's only one reality. And that is, we can also call it love, because love is the entanglement of all experience in sentient beings and the caring and the inseparability that comes from that. So I'd like to end this conversation here by saying, Rudy, I love you. And we've had an amazing adventure and more to come.
We always have amazing adventures. I always look forward to them. They're always a little bit different. And, you know, and I can't wait to do the next one. Thank you.
So